Imagine you're standing alone in the freezing Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. The temperature has dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Snow is falling so heavily that you can barely see a few meters ahead. There are no roads, no villages, no rescue teams. Just endless white wilderness. Now imagine that, in the middle of the night, something terrifies you so completely that you slash open your own tent from the inside and run into the darkness without your boots, coats, or even your gloves. That sounds like the opening of a horror movie, but it actually happened. And nearly 70 years later, no one can say with absolute certainty why. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in modern history. On the night of February 1st, 1959, 9 experienced hikers disappeared deep in the northern Ural Mountains. Weeks later, rescuers found a scene so strange that it sparked decades of speculation. Their tent had been cut open from the inside. Their footprints led calmly away into the snow. Some bodies were found barefoot. Others were discovered months later with devastating internal injuries. One woman was missing her tongue. Some clothing reportedly contained traces of radiation. Since then, theories have ranged from avalanches and military experiments to secret weapons, unknown creatures, and even extraterrestrials. To understand what really happened, we first need to meet the people at the center of this mystery. These weren't reckless adventurers looking for danger. They were some of the Soviet Union's most experienced young hikers, trained to survive in harsh winter conditions. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now known as Ekaterinburg. Quiet, intelligent, and respected by his classmates, Dyatlov had led several successful expeditions before. The mountain pass where the tragedy occurred would later be named after him. The expedition originally included 10 members. Alongside Igor were Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonischenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Yuri Yudin. They were students, engineers, and outdoor enthusiasts, most in their 20s. Their goal was to earn the highest hiking certification available in the Soviet Union by completing a demanding journey through the remote Ural Mountains during winter. It would be difficult, but they believed they were fully prepared. One member, however, never reached the mountain. Just a few days into the journey, Yuri Yudin developed severe joint pain and became too sick to continue. On January 28, 1959, he said goodbye to his friends and returned home. It was a heartbreaking decision at the time because he wanted to complete the expedition, but that decision unknowingly saved his life. He would become the only member of the group to survive, spending the rest of his life wondering what happened to the 9 friends he left behind. The hikers traveled by train and truck before beginning their trek on skis through deep snow. Along the way, they laughed, took photographs, wrote diary entries, and joked with one another. Those photographs, recovered months later, provide the final glimpses of a group full of confidence and excitement. They smiled into the camera, built campfires, adjusted their heavy backpacks, and marched across frozen rivers. Nothing in their journals suggested fear or concern. They expected to return within weeks and even told friends they would send a telegram once they reached civilization. Their destination lay beyond Mount Otorten, a remote peak whose name is often translated from the local Mansi language as "don't go there," although linguists debate the exact meaning. Nearby stood another mountain known as Kholat Syakhl, meaning dead mountain. While the name sounds chilling today, it likely referred to the area's lack of wildlife rather than any supernatural history. Still, those names would later become part of the legend surrounding the tragedy. As the expedition moved deeper into the wilderness, weather conditions became increasingly difficult. Strong winds pushed heavy snow across the landscape, reducing visibility almost to zero. Navigation became challenging. On February 1st, the group accidentally drifted west of their planned route. Instead of descending into a nearby forest for shelter, they decided to pitch their tent on the exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl. Some researchers believe they wanted to avoid losing altitude and planned to continue the next morning. Others think worsening weather forced them to stop where they were. Whatever the reason, That decision would become one of the most discussed moments in the entire investigation. The hikers carefully cut into the snow to create a flat surface for their large canvas tent. They anchored it securely against the fierce mountain winds and settled in for the night. Based on recovered diaries and evidence inside the campsite, they likely cooked dinner, changed clothes, and prepared for sleep. Their skis were placed beneath the tent to provide insulation from the frozen ground. Boots and heavy winter clothing were neatly arranged inside. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing suggested that within hours, every single one of them would be dead. No one knows exactly what happened after darkness fell. There were no survivors, no witnesses, and no recordings. The only clues were left behind in the snow. Sometime during that freezing night, something caused all 9 hikers to abandon the safety of their tent almost instantly. Instead of using the entrance, they sliced through the fabric from the inside with a knife. Then they stepped into temperatures that could kill an unprotected person in minutes. But the strangest part wasn't that they left. It was how they left. Their footprints, preserved in the snow, showed that they didn't appear to be running. They walked some barefoot, some wearing only socks, into one of the coldest nights imaginable, heading toward a dark forest nearly 1.5 kilometers away. What could possibly make 9 experienced survival experts believe that the freezing wilderness was safer than the shelter they had built with their own hands? That question would haunt investigators, scientists, and millions of people around the world for decades, and the answers waiting beyond that abandoned tent would only make the mystery even darker. Into Part 1. Title: The Dyatlov Pass Incident. History's most terrifying unsolved mystery. The hikers were expected to return to the town of Vizhai by February 12, 1959. Igor Dyatlov had told friends that if the expedition was delayed, it would probably only be by a few days. Because winter expeditions often faced unexpected weather, nobody immediately assumed something was wrong. But as the days passed without a single message, concern quickly turned into fear. Families began contacting the Ural Polytechnic Institute, demanding that search teams be sent into the mountains. On February 20th, after nearly 3 weeks of silence, the first rescue party set out. The team included experienced skiers, teachers, local volunteers, and fellow students who knew the missing hikers personally. Soon, the Soviet military joined the search, bringing helicopters, aircraft, and trained personnel. Day after day, they scanned endless fields of snow, hoping to spot a tent, a campfire, or any sign that the group was still alive. Instead, what they discovered would become one of the strangest crime scenes ever documented. On February 26th, a searcher noticed a dark object barely visible beneath the snow on the eastern slope of Kolit-Syakhl. It was the hiker's tent. At first glance, it appeared damaged by strong winds, but a closer inspection revealed something shocking. The entrance was still closed. Instead, long cuts had been made through the fabric from the inside. Whoever left that tent had not used the normal exit. They had sliced their way out in a desperate hurry. Inside, everything seemed strangely normal. Sleeping bags, backpacks, cameras, notebooks, food, and heavy winter clothing were still neatly arranged. Boots were lined up exactly where their owners had left them. Money, watches, and valuable equipment had not been stolen. There was no sign of a struggle inside the tent. It looked as if the group had simply stood up in the middle of the night and vanished, leaving behind everything they needed to survive. The searchers soon found footprints leading downhill toward a small forest about 1.5 kilometers away. The prints belonged to several people walking together. Some were barefoot, others were only socks. A few appeared to be wearing a single boot. Even more disturbing, the footprints did not suggest panic. There were no signs of running or chaos. The hikers had walked away from their only shelter into temperatures estimated to be below -25°C. Following the trail, rescuers reached the edge of the forest, where they discovered the remains of a small campfire beneath a massive Siberian cedar tree. Nearby lay the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. Both men were wearing only underwear despite the deadly cold. Their hands were badly damaged, and pieces of bark were found beneath their fingernails, suggesting they had desperately climbed the cedar tree. Broken branches high above the ground indicated that someone had climbed nearly 5 meters. possibly trying to see the tent or watch for danger. Just a few hundred meters away, searchers made another heartbreaking discovery. The body of Igor Dyatlov lay face down in the snow. One arm stretched forward as though he had been crawling back toward the tent. Between Igor and the cedar tree, they found Zinaida Kolmogorova, frozen where she had fallen. Soon after, they discovered Rustam Slobodin, lying in the same general direction. All three appeared to have been trying to return to the campsite before collapsing from the freezing temperatures. At first, investigators believed the mystery had been solved. Perhaps the hikers had fled because of an avalanche or some other natural danger. They had become separated, tried to survive near the forest, and eventually froze to death. It seemed tragic, but understandable. Then the medical examinations began, and everything changed. Rustam Slobodin had suffered a fractured skull. Although the injury alone might not have been immediately fatal, it raised serious questions. How had he received such a blow? Even stranger, there were very few external wounds on his body. It was as though something had delivered tremendous force without leaving obvious signs of violence. But the biggest mystery was still hidden beneath the snow. For members of the expedition remained missing. Despite weeks of searching, there was no trace of Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, or Semyon Zolotaryov. Winter conditions made further searches nearly impossible, and rescuers were forced to wait for the snow to begin melting. Nearly 2 months later, on May 4, 1959, searchers finally found the remaining 4 bodies inside a deep ravine about 75 meters beyond the cedar tree. Unlike the first 5 victims, these hikers were better dressed. Some were even wearing clothing that had belonged to their friends, suggesting the survivors had removed clothing from those who had already died in an effort to stay warm. Then came the discoveries that would fuel decades of speculation. Lyudmila Dubinina had suffered multiple broken ribs and was missing her tongue. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a severe skull fracture. Semyon Zolotaryov had crushed ribs. Doctors compared some of these injuries to those seen in high-speed car crashes. Yet the skin covering those injuries showed surprisingly little external damage. There were no deep cuts, no obvious signs of a violent attack, and no evidence that another person had beaten them. One investigator reportedly remarked that the force required to produce such injuries would have been comparable to the impact of an automobile. As investigators examined the bodies more closely, additional details emerged. Some clothing reportedly contained traces of radioactive contamination. Several witnesses later claimed that the victim's skin appeared unusually dark or orange. Though experts believe this was likely the result of decomposition and environmental exposure rather than radiation itself, rumors spread quickly across the Soviet Union. People whispered about secret military experiments, unknown weapons, escaped prisoners, and things far stranger. The official investigation struggled to explain the evidence. There were no signs that another group had attacked the hikers. The footprints belonged only to the expedition members. There was no evidence of robbery. There were no bullet wounds, knife wounds, or animal attacks. The case simply refused to fit any normal explanation. Then, in May 1959, Soviet authorities made a decision that only deepened the mystery. They abruptly closed the investigation. The official conclusion stated that the 9 hikers had died because of a compelling natural force, without explaining what that force actually was. The files were sealed. The mountain pass was closed to visitors for several years. And with that, one of history's greatest mysteries was born. Into Part 2. The discovery of the remaining 4 hikers transformed a tragic accident into one of history's greatest mysteries. Unlike the first 5 victims, these hikers weren't lying on open snow. They were buried beneath nearly 4 meters of snow inside a narrow ravine. It looked as though they had tried to build a shelter after reaching the forest, cutting branches and digging into the snow to escape the brutal wind. But something had gone terribly wrong before they could survive the night. The body of Lyudmila Dubinina, a 20-year-old engineering student, shocked investigators the most. She had suffered multiple broken ribs, and during the autopsy, doctors noted that her tongue was missing. Parts of her lips and soft tissue were also gone. Almost immediately, rumors spread that she had been brutally attacked. Decades later, Forensic experts suggested these injuries were more likely the result of natural decomposition in flowing water and scavenging animals. But the gruesome detail became one of the case's most famous mysteries. Nearby lay Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group at 38 years old. He had extensive chest injuries, including several fractured ribs. Yet remarkably, there were almost no external wounds. It was as if an enormous force had crushed his chest without breaking the skin. Medical examiners later compared the impact to the force of a high-speed car crash. Whatever caused those injuries had delivered incredible pressure in a very short moment. Another victim, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, suffered a severe fracture to the side of his skull. Once again, investigators found very little external damage. No signs of a fist fight, no deep cuts, no weapon wounds. Just catastrophic internal trauma. The injuries were unlike anything investigators normally encountered during mountain accidents. Even experienced doctors struggled to explain how they had occurred. The final member of the group, Alexander Kolevatov, showed fewer traumatic injuries but was found alongside the others, wearing extra clothing taken from friends who had already died. This detail suggested that the survivors had attempted to adapt to the freezing conditions. They weren't acting irrationally. They were making logical survival decisions, sharing clothing and building shelter. That made the mystery even more confusing. If they were thinking clearly, why had they abandoned the tent in the first place? Then came another unsettling discovery. During laboratory testing, investigators found traces of radioactive contamination on some items of clothing belonging to Zolotaryov and Dubinina. The amount wasn't considered immediately deadly, but it was enough to raise difficult questions. Why would ordinary hikers be carrying radioactive clothing? Some researchers later pointed out that Krivonischenko had previously worked at a nuclear facility, meaning low-level contamination was possible. Others argued that this explanation did not account for every finding. The debate continues even today. As the investigation continued, local residents from the indigenous Mansi community were briefly considered suspects. Because the hikers had entered traditional Mansi territory, some investigators wondered whether they had been attacked. But that theory quickly collapsed. The Mansi had an excellent relationship with Soviet authorities, showed no signs of violence, and left no footprints near the campsite. Investigators eventually ruled them out completely. And today, historians agree there is no credible evidence linking the Mansi people to the tragedy. Instead, attention turned toward the Soviet military. Several witnesses reported seeing mysterious orange lights in the sky around the same time as the incident. Others claimed secret weapons tests were being conducted in the region. Since the Soviet Union was known for hiding military projects during the Cold War, these stories spread rapidly. Some believed the hikers had accidentally witnessed a classified experiment and were killed to protect state secrets. However, despite decades of investigation, no convincing evidence has ever confirmed that military forces directly caused the deaths. Perhaps the most popular explanation became the avalanche theory. According to this idea, the hikers heard or felt snow shifting above their tent. Believing an avalanche was about to bury them, they quickly cut open the tent and escaped downhill. But critics argued that the slope appeared too gentle for a major avalanche. Even more importantly, the tent remained standing when rescuers found it weeks later. If a massive avalanche had struck, why wasn't the tent completely destroyed? For decades, every explanation seemed to solve one part of the mystery while creating another. No theory perfectly explained the cut tent, the calm footprints, the severe internal injuries, the scattered bodies, and the decision to leave behind life-saving equipment. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the case became. And that is exactly why, more than 60 years later, the Dyatlov Pass incident continues to fascinate millions of people around the world. End of Part 3. Title: The Dyatlov Pass Incident. History's most terrifying unsolved mystery. For more than 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident remained frozen in mystery. Books were written, television documentaries explored every possibility. Internet forums filled with thousands of theories. Some people blamed aliens. Others believed the hikers were attacked by a mythical creature known as the Yeti. A few even suggested they were victims of a secret Soviet assassination. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and despite decades of investigation, None of these theories could be proven. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case, hoping modern science could finally answer the questions that had haunted investigators since 1959. They reviewed the original evidence, studied weather records, examined the mountain's terrain, and recreated the conditions on the night of the tragedy. Instead of searching for something supernatural, they focused on the simplest explanation that matched the physical evidence. Their conclusion pointed once again toward an avalanche, but not the massive avalanche people had imagined for decades. Investigators proposed that a small slab of compacted snow broke loose above the tent after the hikers had cut into the slope to pitch camp. Hours later, strong winds may have slowly loaded additional snow onto that weakened section until it suddenly collapsed, crushing part of the tent while the hikers were sleeping. If that happened, their reaction suddenly makes sense. Believing a larger collapse could follow, the group escaped immediately by cutting through the side of the tent instead of wasting precious seconds using the entrance. In complete darkness and blinding snow, they moved downhill toward the shelter of the forest. They expected to return once the danger had passed. Unfortunately, they never had the chance. One question still remained. How could a relatively small avalanche cause injuries so severe that doctors compared them to a car crash? In 2021, an international team of researchers, including engineers who had previously worked on computer simulations for Disney's animated film Frozen, used advanced physics models to study exactly that problem. Their findings suggested that a dense block of packed snow sliding onto the hikers could generate enough pressure to produce devastating chest and skull injuries without leaving major external wounds. The simulation didn't prove the avalanche theory beyond all doubt, but it demonstrated something important. Injuries once considered impossible were, in fact, physically plausible. It also explained why some hikers suffered severe trauma while others died mainly from hypothermia. Those closest to the collapsing snow may have been critically injured, while the others escaped with little or no physical damage. Many experts now believe the survivors tried desperately to save one another. They built a fire beneath the cedar tree. They climbed into its branches, perhaps searching for the tent or looking for a safe route back. They removed clothing from friends who had already died, hoping to survive a little longer. They constructed a snow shelter in the ravine, protecting the most seriously injured members of the group. Every decision they made reflected experience, teamwork, and determination, not panic. Even so, not every mystery has been solved. Why did some witnesses report glowing orange lights in the sky? Were they simply distant military flares or natural atmospheric phenomena? Why did traces of radiation appear on a few pieces of clothing? Were they linked to previous employment at nuclear facilities or something else entirely? And why did Soviet authorities seal the investigation so quickly instead of providing a detailed explanation? Those unanswered questions continue to fuel debate among historians and amateur investigators alike. One fact, however, has never changed. There is no credible evidence that the hikers were attacked by another group. No confirmed evidence supports theories involving aliens, monsters, secret assassins, or paranormal forces. Over the decades, those stories have grown because the real event is already so extraordinary that fiction easily attaches itself to the facts. Today, visitors can travel to the mountain pass in Russia that bears Igor Dyatlov's name. A memorial stands in honor of the 9 hikers who never returned home. Every winter, adventurers retrace parts of their route, not to chase conspiracy theories, but to remember the courage and determination of a group of young people who set out on what should have been an ordinary expedition. The Dyatlov Pass incident reminds us that nature does not need supernatural powers to be terrifying. A combination of extreme weather, darkness, freezing temperatures, and a series of unfortunate decisions can create a disaster that appears almost impossible to understand. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, not because it involves monsters, but because reality is capable of producing mysteries that challenge us for generations. So, what really happened on the night of February 1st, 1959? The most likely answer is that 9 experienced hikers became trapped in a chain of events from which there was no escape. A collapsing snow slab, brutal weather, severe injuries, and the relentless cold combined into a tragedy that unfolded over just a few desperate hours. Yet because there were no survivors, the mountain keeps one final secret that may never be revealed. And perhaps that's why the Dyatlov Pass incident continues to fascinate the world. Not because every question has an answer, but because one silent mountain in the northern Ural wilderness still guards the final moments of 9 lives, leaving us with one mystery that refuses to disappear.